Welcome back to the Amazon clone. In this video, we'll focus on using Cypress to do our integration / end-to-end testing. So far our entire application is revolved around signing up and registering and then signing in and then being taken to the main page. So integration testing, that would be a section by itself, testing the authentication section. But considering it's our entire application, it's also going to be an end-to-end testing. So that's the main difference between end-to-end testing and integration testing. We've seen unit testing in the previous video, but integration testing, it tests sections or modules in a cohesive manner, and end-to-end testing is just all of the integration tests together in one big test. Usually when you're working, for a company or, in a large enterprise, you probably won't actually do end-to-end testing. You're probably more likely to do integration tests and a few of those, because the big end-to-end test is more fragile, but it could be valuable in, when testing's really needed, maybe in finance applications or something like that. So let's go ahead and get started here, and we're going to run a npm install -d because we want it in development mode only. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to get the Cypress library here. Cypress is like a testing framework, and allows us to actually, automatically fill in form data and interact with the browser, and we can actually visually see that. It renders a GUI for us in, I believe it's created in Electron, which is a JavaScript for desktop applications. So we'll see that just shortly. So I'm just going to add something to this package.json here. And of course, I've started the Nest server and the MongoDB server, which was used through Docker. And I'm just about to change a test here. So we see that we've got this React script test, and that's our testing for our unit testing. But now that we've got Cypress available to us, let's have a second test here for our end-to-end test. And end-to-end and integration tests, as we mentioned before, there is the separation, but when it comes to naming the files, there's going to be some crossover there. So let's just change this to the Cypress open command. And the first time we run it, it will actually create some stuff for us. So let's just say npm run test e2e. And Cypress is probably one of the best or most popular frameworks, testing frameworks in JavaScript ecosystem at the moment, mainly because it's really easy to use and it integrates well with frameworks or libraries such as React and other things like Angular and stuff like that, as you've seen in the LinkedIn clone if you've followed that series. But as you can see, it's created this browser here for us, and this is where we can actually look at our tests. And if I click on any one of the tests, it actually opens up another page and it starts to, show us a browser and things typing in and stuff like that. So what we want to do is we want to hook up our front end application. So let me just close that for a second. And just in the command line here, I'm just going to run an npm start, and that will start the React server. And we can see that we've got a few things here. We'll mainly be dealing with the integration folder. I have explained some of these other things in my previous videos, and in particular the LinkedIn one, but if you haven't followed that series, fixtures is basically where you have a JSON object and you can have your fake data. So if you followed the unit test in the previous video where we created some mock data and stuff like that, that's that there. I should note at this point that there's a couple of ways you can do your end-to-end test. I find it better to actually use the real data, or the real, use it against the real database. So you're actually making real API calls and all of that sort of stuff. Obviously, you would want to do it in development mode, and you wouldn't want to modify your real database. So that requires you to have separate servers there, or even just do it locally. I just find that's a better way. But another way to do it is by mocking the data. And this is where you would do it. So I'm not going to do it that way. So we won't actually be looking at it like that, but just to mention. So there's also integration. We'll come back to that. And actually we'll go ahead and we'll just delete these files here. This is where we're actually going to write our integration tests. And you can see there's some in here. So we'll build those out. So let me just delete this here. And there's also these notions of plugins here. So right now we're not really using any plugins, but you could have things here like where there's, you know, a relationship with something else, maybe like, you know, ES linting, or, you know, you need some other stronger functionality that doesn't come out of the box. So we won't be working with that. And in support here, there's an index file, and this just has your commands that you have here. We actually won't be using these either, but just to note, you can actually create your own functions here from the Cypress library, which we'll see when we use the integration. And then if you reuse like a sequence of things, like let's say, you know, you fill out a form, but you need to fill out the same form on 2 pages, rather than duplicating the code, you could actually, you know, refactor it higher into a command, and then call that function. So it's just refactoring into commands. And actually there's an example here of one. So you just add a command here, you give it a name, and you take the parameters there, and then you can just go ahead and call that login thing from a file there. But we won't do that. That's just to sort of give a brief overview of the framework that we have here. So in integration, what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and we'll create a file, and we're just going to call this auth-e2e for end-to-end .spec.js. So I'm doing .spec. So, you know, we have the unit testing set up to look at the test files. So they're looking at the test files, just so it's not a clash between the unit test and the end-to-end / integration test. So this is technically an integration test, but integration tests often have E2E. They're not strictly end-to-end tests, but they're end-to-end tests of a particular section. And that distinguishes it from the unit test. So yeah, integration and end-to-end tests, they're closely related and very similar. And unit tests, they're a little separate. They're for like isolated bits of functionality. Okay, so we, in the same way that we create our unit test, we can establish our testing suite here. So let's just go ahead and let's just start to code this out a little bit. Oh, and I've got this here. Something's already running on port 3000, so let's just click yes, and that will open up React on another server. And it's opened on 3001. So we got our other server running on 3000. So we'll test against this 3001. And what we want to test here as a visual represent or a reminder of what we're doing, when we log in, it takes us to the sign-in page. You know, the main page is has guards on it, so it takes us here. Then we want to be able to navigate to the register page by clicking on this button here. We want to fill out all these details here. We want to register. We want to go back to the sign-in page, sign in with that registered user, and then go back to our home page. So we can test all of that, and we don't have to click around or fill things out. We can use Cypress to do that. So let's go ahead and start working on that. And we'll start by giving our end-to-end test a name here. So I'm going to call this Auth, and I'm going to call it end-to-end in brackets here. And then I'm going to have the callback. And usually you just start off with like a simple test just to make sure everything's working. So you can just say it should load and redirect to /signin. And then we have our callback here. And this is where we can use Cypress. So let's just say with Cypress, so there's these, SY initials there. And then this is where you can have all your methods here. So we can go ahead and we can actually visit. And we're actually visiting the HTTP 3001. So let's just grab that in there. Of course, you could refactor this, make it a little cleaner, have a base URL or any of those things, but we just want to focus on the testing here. This is the fundamentals here. And basically Cypress that has this URL method on it where you can see what the URL is. So when we go to here, it should, after, almost instantaneously, it should, and we can just say should, so we can have our assertions here, and it should include sign in here. So here we have the back end up. Here we have the front end up. Let's get one more terminal in here. And let's just CD into our front end here. And then let's go ahead and run the, test end-to-end. So that's going to open up Cypress for us. And we can see that we've got this auth-e2e spec file that we've, just started there. Let's click on that. And we can see that it's opened up this browser here. And we can actually see that it's opened up this here. And it's passed the test. It does, and you can see the browser URL here. We are on the URL /signin. So let's go ahead and just extend this out a little bit, and we'll create another something more to test here. So basically, I think what we'll need to test is, let's just test that our initial application state is the default values. So to be able to do that, let's just create the shape of this here. So it should have the default initial state. And what we can do here, actually, let's just use an arrow function here, is we're going to have, and if we open up something in our features here, in the auth slice here, we can actually get the initial state because pretty much everything is this here. But it's going to be in the auth key here. And then user will be null, and the JWT will be initially null as well. And is authenticated, is loading, is success, is error, they will all be false. So what we want to do is we actually want to be able to get the store. So to be able to do this, we do have to slightly change the what we have in here. So basically what we want to do is when we when we create our application here, essentially what we want to do is we want to detect if it's in the Cypress window or not. And if it is, we can go ahead and we can actually get the store and put it on the window object and then use that data if we need it in the testing of it. So that's how we can get around testing the state of with Redux Toolkit. So I'm just going to bring this in from the store here. So recall that the store is configuring the reducer here, and that's the data that we've put in. to our application. So just down the bottom here, so the app's going to run initially. And let's just create a little type here. So we'll have a type, and we're just going to call it Cypress Window. And this is just going to be the window type and the type of global this. And then union that with the Cypress type. And I don't know exactly what that type is. There's probably a TypeScript definition for that, but we'll just call that any. And then we'll just give the store the type of any there as well. Although strictly speaking, you could probably get the type of the global store if you want. So I'll leave that to you to do. It's not really a concern for this testing. Then I'm just going to say this window equals window as Cypress Window. So what's going on here, if you're not familiar with the window, if I just create this here and I hover over it, you can see that it is of the type window and type of global this, which is what we've got here. And the window object, you know what the window object is it's just all of the access to the global window methods and properties there, like the screen size and all of those sorts of things. So what we want to do is we want to have that, like we want to put the store on that window. You wouldn't want that for in your production application, but this is just a local testing thing, because when you test things and you build out your application, it doesn't, copy all the testing stuff to production. It removes it all. So this is all right to do. And basically we've just taken the window, but we've just extended it by adding one more property or two more properties to it. The Cypress property and the store property. And what that's going to allow us to do is, because when we use Cypress and then we use this particular Cypress browser or that we use here, Cypress behind the scenes, it actually adds that Cypress value to the window. And so if I had something like this, where I said, if this window, and you might want to choose better names and annotate the types a little cleaner if you want, but basically if it is the Cypress window, basically what we'll do is we'll just console log out Cypress window, and then we'll be able to confirm it's not happening in our window, and then we can also see it's happening in the Cypress window. But what we want to do here is, let's just say this window dot store, we want to set that to the store that we've imported here. So that'll give us the state of the application, and that means when we make changes or anything like that, if we were to do so, we'll be able to do that quite easily. So now we have access to that. Let's just go ahead and check out our console here. We can see that we've got this Cypress window here. But if we go ahead and we just refresh this page here and we press F12, we don't have any logs at all. So it is detecting the window in Cypress mode, and in that event, we can add the store there. So with that in mind, let's go back to our end-to-end test here. And now we have this initial app state from is what we're expecting here. We can actually come here and we can say on the Cypress window, there's a method here, and we can say we can get something on the window. So let's get its store, which we've set there, and we can actually go ahead and we can just invoke the method on the store. So this is just calling a function on the store, and we just want to be able to get the state here, and what the state should be equal to, and we need to do deep equal, because we're comparing two objects that are nested with other objects. So if you know how object equality works, you have to do deep equals for that. And then we can just go ahead and we can just put in our initial app state. So let's just save that. And we can already see that it should have default initial state. So what we can do, well, what that means is, it's successfully set up the application with the state of the store. And then we can have access to that. And then when we do things, we can, if we were to change something, we can access the store and, mutate, change it and then compare things. But I'm not really that interested in that. I just wanted to showcase that in case you want to test state in Redux Toolkit. So the hardest part about testing is just setting it all up. And this is the setup for Redux Toolkit here. So what I want to do now is let me just prove that this is the initial state. If I set this to true, that means our test should fail. And it just takes a few seconds for that to happen. But we can see that that initial state is wrong because it doesn't match the initial state that we've set up here. So, let's say you had light mode and dark mode or something like that, or, let's just say our state was light mode and dark mode. And then when you click the button, it changes it to light mode. We could actually detect that click, then detect the state of the application. We could re-get the state, and then we could see if that property light mode or dark mode is activated there. So that's that. Now the next thing I want to do here is I want to actually have another test, of course. And I want to say it should navigate to the SignIn page it should navigate to SignIn. It should navigate to SignIn upon registering. And then we'll have our callback here. So the way Cypress works is we need to actually hook into our elements here. And it's, front-end platform agnostic. So we just need to have some IDs and stuff like that. So let's just go ahead and open up the sign-in form component and the registration form component. We'll start off with the sign-in form here. So obviously one thing you could do here is when you sign in, you could check the state and then get the JSON Web Token and then detect that it's there. And that's probably how you would want to do something like that. But we've sort of seen how that works. So let's go ahead and do something that we haven't seen that works. And that's just, clicking on links, typing in form fields and submitting events. That's sort of a fundamental thing of Cypress. So to be able to do that though, we need to have some hooks where we can hook into, not hooks in the React sense, but we need to be able to access the DOM elements. So if we just take a look at this registration form here, we can see that we've got a text field for the name with an ID of name. We've got a text field of the email, password, and confirm password, all with the IDs consistent with the name there. Then we've also got this register button. So this is the register button here. So let's just go ahead and put an ID on this so we can grab hold of it. And let's just call this the register link. And then let's just go down here. Actually, that should be sufficient for our purposes. So what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and we'll get that element there. So that is an ID, so it has the hash symbol there. If it was just a DOM element, you wouldn't need the hash element there. You may have an issue with components, but you could just put an ID on it. And that's exactly what we're doing here. We're just putting a ID on it. And then we can go ahead and we can just click that. And well, let's just see that so far. Oh, our default state didn't work because we did not change this back. Let's change this back. Okay, so we're getting an error here. Okay, so it expected to find something, but it didn't find it. So there's obviously some sort of issue going on here. So let's just try and investigate this. We have a button here. We have that's the register button on the registration form. But this is the sign in form. So rather than, yeah, it's just the wrong button, that's all. Because we're initially on the sign in thing. So we want to click on this registration link from the sign in page. And then when we click on that, then we come here and then we want to fill out these 4 fields here. And then we want to click register here. We want to wait for that to happen. And then when we register, it should take us back to the sign in page. So this register link, I'm actually going to, on this registration form, make this a registration button. And I'll just actually copy that before I do so. So in the sign in form, if I go to / this link here, and all these aren't, you know, the primitive DOM elements in HTML. These are the, you know, the built-in, well, they're coming from libraries and they're components here. So I'm just going to have this register link here. So let's just see what happens now. And it happens really fast, but we can see that it's actually taken us to the register page here. And if we go back to our test here, what we want to do is we want to fill out those fields. So let's just copy this first one down and recall that the IDs are the name, email, password, and confirm password. So when we click on each of those fields, there's actually this really cool method here, and it's just called type. And I'm going to need a name, but I'm also going to need it in the next test. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come up here and I'm just going to create a random integer here. And I do that by taking a random number, which a random number is any, you know, number between 0 and 1. So you could get 0.5554 or whatever. And then what we'll do is we times that by, say, you know, 1,000,000. And then you take the floor of that, so that rounds it down to the nearest integer. So the reason I'm doing that is because when I do these tests, it's actually going to put data in the database, and I'm not going to have a cleanup to delete them, although I probably should in reality. But you know, disregarding that, you could set that up. You got all the tools to set that up now. Just need to make a API request to delete that. But the problem is you need to create the functionality on the front end to call that method. So I'm not going to do that, but you could do that, and you probably should do that. But I'm just going to, you know, and obviously there's a 1 in a million chance that it clashes, but it doesn't really matter. If you really wanted, you could, you know, do something more sophisticated here. But I'm going to take the email and I'm just going to say at mail.com here. And then I'm just going to have a password. And this is just going to equal the string password. So that means in here, I'll just type out the name, and then I'll duplicate this for the 4 fields. We have email here, password here, and password here as well, because we're going to change the email, the password, and the confirm password. And let's just check this out. I thought this was cool the first time I saw it. You can actually see it typing it all out, and then just generates these random numbers here. So we can register, and then if we do it again, it will just register another random one. So that's pretty cool, and you can actually do some like web scraping stuff with this. This is probably one of the better end-to-end testing, JavaScript end-to-end testing. Puppeteer is probably a second favorite, but to be fair, I'll probably just use Cypress from this point forward, because it really lets you interact with these single-page application libraries and frameworks like React and Angular, and you can visually see it, and it can save you lots of typing and stuff like that. So quite useful. But with web scraping, you can go to, type in websites and type a bit of code out to get elements. You can use the dev tools to hover over elements and get the IDs of things. Like, it doesn't have to be just on our local server. And then if you have like repetitious tasks that you can perform, maybe you're on Stack Overflow, you want to get every ID of a comment, for example, and then you want to scrape all those into all the comments, and you want to, change the data structure of that. And then, if you've ever seen those websites where they have all those questions that are asked, and then usually they're formatted really badly, but they usually take web scraping from websites and then make new websites out of them. But you could get creative. If anyone has any cool web scraping ideas, post a comment below. So what I want to do now is I actually want to click the button. So let's use our Cypress to be able to get the particular thing. So that's on the registration form. So we have the register button there. So with that register button, we can just use that. What's going on here? Yeah, so we get the register button, and then we click it. Now what we'll do here is there's actually an API call going on here. Now what I'm going to do, I think API calls, they usually happen pretty quick, and since it's on my local machine, it's going to happen very quick. Usually they're about 100 milliseconds, or I don't know actually about that. They're anywhere between like 10 and 100 milliseconds usually. If you got computationally expensive things, it could take longer. But I'm just going to put 500 here. Obviously, you want to play with this number. And this just saves us from doing any fancy stuff. Like, we'll just wait for it to happen. And then when something's happened, you can just, check the URL, and then it should include SignIn. So just to have a quick look here, we're on the register page. Let's actually save this. See, it's typed in that. What's happened here? It couldn't find the register button, and that's okay. Registration. The register button. Just check that's the right spot. Yeah, it looks like it's the right spot. Register button. So we get we need a hash. It's just the ID here. All right, so let's do that again. It's cool. I like seeing it typing out. I don't have to click that. comes back over here. It's on this sign in page. Oh, did I get that wrong? This should be sign in like that. So let's try that one more time. And this is where it saves us the typing there. And then it passes all those tests. It's back on the sign in page. So now what we want to do is we want to sign in. So let's go ahead and test that. And actually you can see that you can't actually click this button. So let's just test that it's disabled here. Because we've got the same ID for both the registration and the sign in pages. We might want to test that those aren't pre-filled in, for example, and causing it to, well, maybe that would be behavior we would want, but in this case, we want to start off and type it ourselves. And in such event, the button should be disabled initially. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this part here and then close it out. So this next test we're doing here is it's going to say the sign in button should be disabled. And we actually did this in a unit test in the previous video. I do appreciate the unit test probably wasn't as comprehensive as we like, but we can see that in this integration test that we're doing now, we're sort of covering all things. Whereas the unit test, it just tests things in isolation, like if the text fields were, you know, if they're valid, and then test that button there. And that's good to do, and helps us to write, you know, testable code, so it can be consumed easily. But the integration tests, they really come in handy because they're quite easy to set up, but two, they're more practical in a cohesive manner where you test the front end, but then you also have things coming from the APIs, and then it changes the state of this application, and it tends to be pretty good. The downside is they become more fragile as they get larger, like an end-to-end test of the whole application. But if you're building, clean software, it's probably something you want to invest your time in, especially if you're building large software and large teams. You can imagine if someone came in here and, let's say they were just styling the form or whatever, and then they somehow, for whatever reason, they took the disabled thing off. Then when they come to these tests, it would fail the test. And it also points out things you wouldn't think about, like if we have the state can get complicated for the entire application. We do have access to the state, as we've seen here. This is how we can get the state, and that's how we can test the state as well. So we could, if we wanted to do more complicated things, like we sign in, maybe test that the JSON web token is there, and honestly that is something we probably should be doing, but we've sort of seen how to do that here. So sign in button should be disabled here. So yeah, I mean, testing's good. So let's say sign in button should be disabled. So we can just say, well, we need to get the sign in button. So that's on the sign in form. So let's just go to sign in. Maybe it's sign-in. Oh, that's the header. We want this one here. So we don't actually have an ID on here. So what we'll do is we'll just give it this ID here. And we'll just say that this is the sign in button. And just to show another thing, you don't always have to get it based on the ID, or if you had two buttons and let's say you're getting it by a class and it had the same class, for example, you can use this rather than getting it directly. You can actually say contains. So we can actually contain, and we only have an ID, so it's not obvious of benefits here. But let's say we had two buttons, both with a class of ID, of register button here. But then I want to get this one Oh, this is the wrong button, by the way. This should be, where the hell is the thing? What did I do here? Oh, I'm on the registration form, so that's okay. I should be over here on the sign-in form to get the sign-in button. And then the sign-in button has sign-in text here. But imagine there was two buttons and we're getting it by the class name. But then they had different text in here. Or alternatively, we could get it by like a property that's on there. So in that scenario, what we can do here is we can say, well, we get the sign-in button. So now we should be on this sign-in page here. So we get this button. But as a second property, we can actually put in the text there. So we saw that this was sign in, for example. So, and you can do it based off just the text as well, or a combination of the IDs or classes or properties and the text, just in case you need that functionality there. And you can also tack on things like, we've seen have attribute, but you can actually tack on not. And this first should argument, we've seen, you know, it just reads as English, but you know, you include something or you have an attribute of something, and pretty much anything you can think of, you can have here. And then you can have the inverse by just tacking on not here. So now we want to test that there's no attribute. And we could test any attribute here or test the absence of any attribute. We're specifically looking for the disabled attribute here, but maybe you'll be looking for, you know, if it has variant or, you know, something like that. So we can just go ahead and do this. And then we can just save here. And then we register, it signs in here. The sign in button should be disabled. But we have some sort of issue going on here. Let me just look at the code, look at the error. So should navigate to sign in upon registering. That pass. This one does not pass. Timed out. Okay. So it should, the sign in button should be disabled. So oh, well, this should be has attribute. So now we make another guy, and we've probably created lots of, you know, users in our database. Ideally, we want to clean it up, but it's not a big deal for development purposes. And now we see that the button is disabled and we can't click it as well. So that verifies it. And whenever you're doing tests, I always like to make sure that they fail first. Not that I went out of my way to do it then, but it's always good to make sure it errors first, so then you can confirm that the test is working, because you can get into situations where you think that, you know, for example, you might say test that there's no property there, but that passes, but it could pass because the property hasn't been rendered. And so you might want to do something simpler in that case to test the existence of something and then testing it. But you also want to test the inverse of it first to make sure that things can break. So let's just add a couple more tests here. Let's just do a similar thing as we did here, but now we want to, and if I can just, well, this is hard. I might use shift down. I can't get the sensitivity of the scroll thing. All right, let's just grab this thing here. Now, let's just delete a few things here. So what I'm going to do here is, now I'm on that page, it should show, well, we've seen that the sign button should be disabled. So correct details should enable sign in button. So we don't need this clicking here. It's email and password, the ID on both the registration and sign in form here. So we can just do that here. And then rather than this stuff here, we can say, well, we can just have this here again, and then tack on that not operator, or well, negation that we've thought about there. And then we can see that this test now pass. And that's good because we are able to click that and it has pre-filled this out. And let's just do one final test here to make sure everything's working. We're doing the integration test of the whole Auth module, which is our whole application. So technically it is an end-to-end test right now, although of the entire application. But as you can see, let's say you had some extra functionality where you click on some products, add it to the cart, you'll just continue to add that more tests in the same thing if you're doing a full end-to-end test. But as you can see, it's probably best to separate the modules, make them, they're still big cohesive units, but just to have a bit of separation there, because you get pretty much all the benefits from that and the tests become less fragile. But if you do want the end-to-end test, I'll probably go about doing it just in a very, very similar way here. So let's just copy one more of these tests here, and this will be the final test, and then we'll do the wrap up. So we should say it should navigate to home page. And if you want it to be more precise, you could check for tokens and all that sort of stuff. I'll leave that as an exercise to the viewer, but we've set up the testing environment here, which is the hardest part. We've seen the fundamental things, and from here it's just a matter of playing with the documentation and matching it to the use case of your particular application. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to say, well, I do want to get the sign in button here, and I think I mentioned this in the previous video, but you don't have to, when you're doing testing, it's not really worth the time to spend refactoring heaps, making clean, you know, you could refactor this into a variable and all these sorts of things, but it's not really the point of testing. You want to keep your production code clean. This code doesn't actually even make it. But if it's something it's up to you really, if you, how well you want to organize things. I usually like to keep things organized and super clean, but when it comes to tests, I just sort of try and get the job done sort of thing. And what we'll do here is we'll click the sign in button. That does an API call, so let's just wait a little bit, say 500 milliseconds here. And then what we'll do here is we'll do two tests here. We'll test that the URL does not include sign-ins because it's on the sign-in page. So let's test that it navigates away from that, while also testing that it should include strictly just the slash here like that. Let's go ahead and save that. Creates an account, types it all in, types in the sign-in, takes us to here, and passes all of the tests. So well done, everyone. We've done the integration / end-to-end test with React and Cypress. We also done the inclusion of the React Redux toolkit if needed to include that in there. So yeah, in summary, we just installed the Cypress library. You know, we went to the package JSON. We created this script here. We went through the folders here. We explained what they all do. Then we focused on the core features of Cypress. So we've seen it helps us, you know, type things out repetitive tasks, and helps us test for the functionality in a cohesive manner. And particularly we did an end-to-end test or an integration auth test, just to check the URLs of things, making sure things actually worked. We checked the state with Redux Toolkit. We generated some users here, and we registered and signed in and checked some disabled buttons and all of that sort of stuff, and then navigated to the right pages. So that's pretty much all of the fundamentals you need there. So yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to cover there for testing in React. In the next video, what I want to get into is actually building out the front end a little bit more. So, when you actually register and you're on the home page, I want this to be a products page. So it's just going to have a whole bunch of products there. And then also when you click them, it will add it to a cart. So that's what I want to set up in the next video. And then in the following video, we'll get to the finale, which is actually setting up the Stripe payment gateway. So I'm looking forward to that. And stay tuned. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.